please join me in welcoming Dr. Juma to see us.
Thank you both for the very kind introduction. I spent a great 2 days here and got a practical present I thought I should actually use for my talk. I never get anything I don't put into practice immediately. So it's not very practical right now. Right now it's a little dark. Thank you for the glasses. I'm going to wear them on the plane back. I actually have a proposal for you, which is that you have a great audience tonight. Why don't we just declare the talk a success and then go and have a reception or something like that? I'm delighted to be here, partly because of the idea that you do have here at CSU a new center on African studies that can actually help to work in a way that reflects contemporary Africa. So a lot is happening on the continent. And what I really wanted to share with you is some of my own thinking about where African agriculture might be headed, both in light of opportunities on the continent at the moment, growing interest in investing in African agriculture, but also being able to connect with concerns about ecological management, conservation of biological diversity. That's called the potential transition towards sustainable agriculture. Let me start with a caveat. I'm going to be using the word Africa, but I'm also conscious of the fact that Africa is a fairly large continent, very diverse, and so do forgive me if I appear to be suggesting that Africa is a country. I get reminded all the time on Twitter, particularly by my UK colleagues, that Calestous, Africa is not a country. And I say, please tell me more. It's big enough. You can fit in there the United States, China, Western Europe, India, Argentina, and have sufficient room to sneak in Britain. So another way of thinking about the size of the continent is it's 3 times bigger than the United States minus Alaska. So it's a fairly large place. And this also explains both some of the challenges that the continent faces, but also the opportunities that are associated with having just great variety on the continent, where you can experiment with different ideas in different places and then explore ways by which people can learn from each other. So that's a great benefit in terms of experimentation. A huge challenge in terms of infrastructure and connectivity. And I'm happy to chat a little bit about that in the period of Q&A. But I wanted to go back to just a bit of my own background. These are 2 books I published the same year in 1989. One was exploring the potential of using biological diversity as a foundation for agricultural transformation. So I spent a bit of time looking at particularly Kenya's use of indigenous vegetables and crops. And then at the same time, it was the early days of the beginnings of advances in genetic engineering. So I was starting to explore ways by which you could bring ecology and botany on the one hand, and molecular biology and genetics, advances in genetics on the other. That I thought that these 2 fields actually belong together, that they would be over time complementary. But what seems to have happened over the last 20 years or so is that these fields have grown apart. And what I want to argue is that there is now an opportunity to actually bring them back together, partly because of a greater awareness on the importance of nutrition in agriculture, the connection between nutrition and agriculture on one hand, but also in terms of greater understanding of the genetic endowment of the African continent, basically as a result of advances in science and technology on one hand, but also just diagnostic tools that allow scientists to be able to map genetic diversity at different levels, whether it's microbial, soil microbe, all the way to the genetics of trees. So that's what I really wanted to explore a little bit, which is the potential of bringing back these two fields after a couple of decades of a kind of divergent growth. And I was inspired mostly by thinking about just the diversity of crops that are consumed worldwide. It's estimated that roughly 50,000 different plants are consumed in some part of the world, and yet only 3 of them account for close to 75% of the calorific intake of the global human population. And how we got there was essentially at the expense of this huge endowment of genetic resources that could be leveraged for African agriculture. I usually do a quiz of where different crops originate, and I was advised by my colleagues that when you go to Colorado, you can do a quiz, but don't mention hemp. So I decided I'm not going to do a quiz, because whenever I've done this quiz, I've always included hemp. And every time I mention hemp, people think it's from Jamaica, so which it isn't. And there's a kind of a resurgence of interest in diversity of genetic resources, mostly driven by this new concern over nutrition, but also guided very much by advances in scientific knowledge. So 4 or 5 years ago, I put together a book in response to a famine in the Horn of Africa, basically exploring this idea that Africa could feed itself in a generation. And in fact, my motivation for putting this argument forward was the potential of leveraging these diverse crops that are consumed across Africa, but in pockets of populations. They have not been the subject of large-scale support for research. That's what one of my motivation for writing the book was essentially that opportunity that we can actually change African agriculture. I launched it in the company of 5 East African presidents. The launch was hosted by the president of Tanzania. You can see they are really happy to receive the book. It was an extraordinary event because they were launching a book whose contents they hadn't seen. And they had to trust me that the book did not contain insults of presidents. So each one of them, I had only 10 copies. The book hadn't actually been released by the publishers. I had only 10 copies. And each of the presidents gave a copy to their special assistants to read very quickly through whether it was legitimate to launch it. And we're sitting there waiting, thinking, no, this is just a typical lateness that people are accustomed to, but it's because the special assistants were quickly reading through it. But you notice the title of the event. That was picked very carefully by the president of Tanzania, which was food security and climate change. They're starting to observe that the changes in the environment, whether it was influenced by climate change or just regional ecological variations, were starting to have implications for food security, which presidents needed to be aware of because of the consequences of food insecurity for broader national security. We launched the book. We just released a second edition of the book. And that coincided with a great interest in Africa, which is a continent that's 11% of the world population, but roughly between 50 and 60% of the arable land available worldwide is on the African continent. So this is the one region which is likely to experience great focus on expanding agricultural production, not just to feed the continent itself, but to feed the rest of the world as well, or parts of the rest of the world. Currently, Africa imports somewhere in the neighborhood of 83% of its food, so heavily dependent on imports. 20 years ago, Africa used to be a net exporter of food. It's now a net importer of food. In fact, Africa exports less food than Thailand exports. Just a sense of comparison. And so our argument is that with this potential, maybe the time has come to think about doing agriculture differently, not just pursuing the same old models that have worked elsewhere, and assuming that those would be the ideal models for African countries, which is basically getting back to sustainable agriculture as the way forward. And my view of sustainable agriculture includes the ability to leverage this decentralized, diverse crops that are grown across the continent that could become part of the food basket. The trends in conventional crops have not been very encouraging. The Africa produces, the yields are very low, roughly 1/10 of the yields in the United States. And so a lot of effort is going into figuring out how to raise yields. And you find this across the board, not just in corn. You find it in peanuts, which is a major staple in Senegal. You can see that in the 60s, 65, today's yields in Senegal are lower than what they were in 1965. Part of it is basically changes in soil structure, depletion of nutrients, loss of productive capabilities, whereas peanut production elsewhere is grown quite significantly in terms of yields. So it gives you just an idea of what the challenges are. Same story with bananas in Tanzania, big increase initially, and then a significant decline in yields. But what's interesting, this is an instructive slide, which is one area where we've seen an increase in yields is in Ethiopia in sorghums. And the main reason there is that because sorghums are indigenous to Africa, Ethiopian scientists have had a great access to diversity within the species, which they have been able to use for breeding and adapting it to different ecological conditions across Ethiopia. So it's an example of where if you leverage domestic genetic material that is diverse, you have greater possibility for new combinations to increase yield. So my claim is that was put into indigenous African crops, you'll have much greater potential for expanding yields, but also you will have very happy consumers. Africans resonate very positively with their traditional crops. And so every time donor agents have done surveys in Africa of what they thought, asked about the priorities of Africans in crop production, they always, in most cases, the Africans would list their indigenous crops at the top of the list. And this is not something that donors usually like to see because they have familiarity with investing in those particular areas. So they generally don't get funded. And so that got me thinking, especially like how do you go about doing it? And there's some interesting work that has been done. This a process actually initiated by the late Norman Borlaug, who did in 1996 worked on the production of this first volume of just a selected number of cereals that are consumed across Africa. It's a very, very small sample that indicated what was actually possible. And that was followed by the 2 volumes on vegetables. The first volume, but I was part of the 2 volumes, which again was probably one of the last major works that Norman Borlaug actually oversaw, because he was very, very convinced that this offered a great possibility for Africa to have a new beginning in defining its own agricultural revolution, as it were, instead of this idea of importing revolutions from elsewhere. Africa could build on biological resources and create new farming systems. And that work is really, for me, it's the most important challenge for African agriculture today. Not just African agriculture, but also thinking about global agriculture, in that it would help to bring recruit new crops and new sources of food into the global system that would diversify the global basket. These are just a couple of examples of some of my favorite plant that's actually quite widely grown in Africa, Sabacomorensis, which is a fruit tree in the parts of Western Kenya, where I was doing some research in the late 80s. Every time you mentioned it, there are some places where it was lost, and they only preserved in local song. And whenever you mentioned it, people into a song. And the song was basically the carrier of the knowledge surrounding that plant. And we didn't know what it looked like, but the descriptions gave us an idea. We looked around and we found out that it existed on the Ugandan and Tanzanian side of Lake Victoria. And the challenge was basically being able to breed it and adapt it to different ecological conditions. It grew it's a vine and grew mostly along rivers. The rest are probably known to some of you. The big opportunity that I've been exploring is this area of advances in the sequencing of genomes. That this is just made possible to have access to genomic information that can now be used to help in new breeding programs. And I'm not talking about the classical genetic engineering of moving crop genes across different species. I'm just talking about functional genomics, of just being able to understand better the genetic characteristics of these indigenous crops. And this was not possible before. You couldn't even justify it. I remember, is this on record? Is anybody tweeting today? I remember at a meeting of the African Academy of Sciences, and I mentioned something about Africa's indigenous crops, and the CEO of one of the major American grain companies said, I was talking too much about these vegetables and fruits, and he said, "You are just emotionally attached to your traditional crops." And I said, "Yeah, I think you are also emotionally attached to corn." And it involved some mediation by the coordinators of the meeting. Otherwise, this meeting wasn't going to end very well. But now it's really a different story. We are down to close to being able to sequence a genome at the cost of $1,000 in literally a number of hours. And the possibilities for sequencing genomes of crops have significantly expanded. For example, when sequencing of the human genome becomes part of the regular diagnosis in hospitals, you go to see your doctor, and the first thing they do is they spend an hour sequencing your genome. I started to think that's a great moment to bring your seeds as well. So when they're sequencing your genome, they can also sequence your seeds from your community, and then you can go back to the CD with your DNA sequenced and also your crop genome. And some of these machines, like the one from Illumina, can sequence up to 80 genomes at the same time. So there's no lack of capability for sequencing of genomes. I had a conversation with a colleague who was just stepped down recently from the BGI, the Beijing Genomics Institute. And he just said, look, we can do this for free. Any African doing it for free for some institutions. So this just gives you this new opportunity to revisit these traditional crops and have a better understanding of their genetic attributes, nutritional content, agronomic potential in terms of being able to breed them and adapt them to different conditions. And it's being done. This is God intervened. This is a project run by God out of Kenya. It's a team that is sequencing the genome orphan crops. That's the term used for it. That's how Shapiro of Mars Corporation. Some of you know him. People used to call him Santa Claus And I was comfortable with him being called Santa Claus until he decided to play God, which is to sequence genomes. And at that point, I decided he was no longer just Santa Claus. He's God. But he's run these workshops now, four of them out of East Africa, and basically sequencing the genomes and making them available, the data sets available to Africans to actually work on figuring out what the sequences can do. And that's a great opportunity to build up new partnerships in functional genomics. In that the biggest challenge before was sequencing them. That is no longer the problem. In fact, the task of functional genomics is a human resource question. So I've been working with a number of African countries to get this functional genomics to become a standard part of undergraduate training in African universities. In fact, some of it can be done by high school kids anyway. But this gives you an indication of what could be done where the entry barriers are very low. You can do things which you couldn't do in the past, which is have a better understanding of the genetic characteristics of these various diverse crops. And then we have in the new frontier, which is gene editing possibilities. Again, very, very low entry barriers. If you take, say, CRISPR-Cas9, with $100, you can put together a kit that can help African universities get engaged, particularly in the area of crops. And the reason why this is of interest to me was when we did the two previous volumes of the National Academy of Sciences. There were a number of reasons given by the contributors to the volume as to why these crops were not widely being utilized. They included just lack of knowledge on the agronomic practices. People could harvest it in the wild, but they didn't know how to germinate them. They didn't know how to propagate them. There were issues that had to do with the susceptibility to pests. Some of them was, so you needed to consume them as soon as you harvested them. Otherwise, the pests got there before you did. And so being able to figure out how to control the pests, learn a bit more about how to propagate them. And then a third one was shelf life. Many of them had very short shelf lives, especially vegetables. So if you could figure out a way of just breeding programs that could help to extend the shelf life, you will broaden the market for it. A fourth one was just lack of knowledge on how you process the products. Again, there's greater knowledge now on food processing than there was, say, 20 years ago. And so you can also start to think about ways by which you can select for different traits. This is one of my favorite examples of what we've done with the wild mustard. Can you do the same with these vegetables, indigenous vegetables? In fact, it's been done extensively with amaranth, which is selected in some places for seed, in other places for the leaves. So the same breeding interventions could be done for a lot of different crops, which would then increase the diversity of those crops, increase the potential creation of new markets for the actual use. And also includes dealing with other issues like land tenure, for example. This is aerial yam that is grown quite extensively on the slopes of Mount Elgon. I identified it when I was doing some research there. And farmers liked it. I noticed that the farmers that had very little land preferred to have aerial yams because it's a vertical crop as opposed to being horizontal. Same nutritional content as potatoes. And so you can start to get into crops like that tend to address new concerns. I was thinking if you did this, you could then start to grow this in your own house anyway through using hydroponics, for example. And that area of tree crops, this is a vine, but when you start to get into an area of tree crops, again, you start to identify new possibilities that also help to deal with the, say, climate variability. An example of that is breadfruit. which is now being basically from the Pacific. There's a great facility in Hawaii, the National Tropical Botanical Garden, which has been run by Dan Reagan for almost 30 years. It's collected like 250 different varieties of breadfruit that is now being sold in Africa. Again, the most interesting part of it is land use. You know, it's a tree crop, it's vertical, very little need for agricultural inputs, and the tree starts fruiting after 4 to 5 years and lasts between 50 and 70 years. There are very few crops that have similar characteristics. It's just another way of thinking about how to expand the food basket by leveraging genetic resources, biological diversity, in this case, moving into the area of tree crops. And you can different ways. You're completely short of land. These are approaches that are being used in Africa now to grow all sorts of vegetables. You can donate your old plants to African countries. They become a farmland. People are very creative in the way they use resources. And this is a little story that, not a little story, but an article that appeared in a Nature magazine recently, on June 9th, written by, in fact, a resident of Colorado. The reporter who wrote this story lives in Denver. And she visited Kenya and was really surprised to find, one, a vibrant research program in one of the Kenyan universities, Jomo Kenyatta University of Agriculture and Technology, that is basically breeding, conserving, and propagating indigenous. And the fact that there's no policy focus on it, there's no going to this field. And it's happening in of universities, basically driven by passion, interest, and cultural affiliation to tradition. Despite all the challenges we see, African research and popular opinion work on this. They're making them. These crops are making to the market. There are markets that are just devoted to selling traditional crops. So there's a whole new effort to revive and propagate these crops that makes it hard to think of them as lost crops anymore. And to me, that's a foundation that's really important to build on, which is that it's happening in universities. So they're becoming a basis for scientific research. And then through universities, they're being propagated to communities around universities. And that got me thinking that university networks that start to focus more on how to leverage the world's biological resources to expand the food base. And in this case, Africa might be a very interesting place to actually start. And that's a challenge I would like to offer to CSU, that this could be an opening of bringing conservation and sustainable use of biological resources back together, where there's a motivation of the obvious economic benefits, which is basically getting this to the marketplace. And the fascination with it at the moment is kind of a fad in some places, but actually creates a real possibility to raise awareness about crops that may have been taken for granted in the past. The interest in improving nutrition is another entry point. And the third one is purely academic one, which is that, in my view, the best way to introduce genetics or crop genomics in an African setting is to ask young people to sequence their own traditional crops. You can't get a better source of motivation than that. So there are a lot of reasons you could basically use to advance this new area, which helps to bring together conservation and food security. So at this point, I think I'd like to stop here And I promised that I would answer some questions. So I'm open to questions. If I don't have the answer, I will just tell you, sorry, I can't.